1850s and 1860s, Edwin Booth was the man. He was this extremely famous American actor who basically anywhere he went in America, people would know who he was. He was extremely recognizable, a household name, an A-list celebrity through and through. But his acting prowess and his career and his fame, those are not the things we remember him for. In early 1865, when Edwin was 31 years old and was at the height of his acting fame, he walked into a New Jersey train station and walked through the building to the actual platform where the trains are. And as soon as he turned a corner and actually saw the train that he wanted to board, he very quickly realized that he probably was not going to get on that train. There was already this huge throng of people out on the platform pressed up against the side of this train, and they're all waving their arms around and yelling. And in the middle of this big group of people with his back pressed up against the train was the train's conductor, whose job was to sell tickets in addition to driving the train. But from Edwin's perspective, it seemed fairly obvious based on the conductor's body language and what some of the people in the crowd were yelling that there just weren't enough tickets. That's why this big unruly group had formed, because all these people were rushing forward trying to buy one of the last few tickets. Now, Edwin could have very easily just walked up and announced himself and shown his very famous face, and almost certainly he would have gotten a ticket. But to this point, Edwin had not been recognized in this train station, and so he wanted to keep a low profile, and so he decided against that idea. Instead, he decided he would just kind of join this big group and, try to flag down the conductor and try to buy one of these tickets, and if he didn't, so be it. And so Edwin, instead of going to the back of this group, he went around to the right side, close up against the side of the train, and right as he got to the outside of the group and he turned in towards the group, he looked up at where the conductor was, and he saw the conductor turning around and walking back into the train. He had clearly sold all of his tickets, and so anyone who had not purchased one yet, like Edwin, they were out of luck. They'd have to wait for the next train. Edwin was about to just walk away and wait for the next train when he noticed the crowd in front of him. They didn't disperse like he was doing. Instead, they all seemed to kind of surge forward towards the train, which was now moving, and as they pushed forward as if they were going to jump onto this train even though they didn't have tickets, one man who was towards the front of this group, right up against the train, he falls to the ground and gets trapped halfway under the train. His lower half was literally on the tracks under the train, and his upper half is now under this big crowd of people that are now trampling him. And so Edwin can see very clearly that if someone does not grab this guy and pull him out soon, he's going to get run over by the train. And so Edwin, without any hesitation, he jumps forward onto the ground on the platform, and he reaches his hand out through the feet of all these people in this crowd, and he grabs the collar of the guy who had fallen, and he pulls him. And as he's pulling him, this guy who's on his back, he starts pushing with his legs and his feet, and within about a fraction of a second, they yank him out from under the train, and the guy who had fallen and Edwin are lying on their backs on the platform. And before they could even talk to each other, they sat up and watched as a big train wheel rolled over that piece of track where this guy had just been laying. Edwin had saved his life. The guy he had saved was a 21-year-old named Robert. And so the two of them, they stand up and they face each other for the first time. And when Robert sees Edwin, he gasps because this is Edwin Booth, the mega celebrity. He could not believe that was the guy who had just saved him. And while Robert was very thankful, he also was just totally dumbfounded at the absurdity of the situation he was in. And so eventually Edwin just says, hey, I'm glad I was here to help you. No big deal. Next time be more careful. And then at some point, the men just shook hands and parted ways. Edwin would eventually get on the next train and he would go wherever it was he needed to go. And before long, his very busy schedule kind of occupied his mind and he had kind of forgotten about what happened on the train platform. But a few days later, Edwin got a letter in the mail from a very high-ranking government official thanking him for saving Robert's life. Because it would turn out Robert Lincoln was the eldest son of the then President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Now, to be clear, Edwin was extremely famous and had lots and lots of influence and knew lots of very important people, but he had never had any interaction with anyone in the Lincoln family before he met Robert on the train platform. So it was just a crazy coincidence that this mega celebrity happened to save the life of the president's son. But this coincidence was nothing compared to the coincidence that occurred next. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, so roughly 3 months after Edwin saved Robert, Robert's father, President Lincoln, sat down in a private seating area to watch a play at a Washington, D.C. theater. During the production, at around 10:15 p.m., a man snuck into the private seating area and shot the president to death. The killer was Edwin's younger brother, John Wilkes Booth. This assassination had nothing to do with Edwin or his interaction with Robert on the train platform. This was an assassination that was formulated and carried out completely independently, meaning it was purely coincidence that just a few months after Edwin saved a Lincoln's life, his own brother took a Lincoln's life. June 10th, 1994, Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California, and they were supposed to be there for the next couple of days. But as she was sitting there, she had this overwhelming urge to want to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. Because she didn't really know what to make of this overwhelming feeling, she shook her husband awake and told him about it. She thought that maybe something was wrong, and he said, you know what, you probably just had a bad dream and you're kind of waking up still half in your dream. It's not a big deal. Just go back to bed. I'm sure everything is totally fine. And in the morning, if you still want to, I'd be happy to leave. And so Deborah said, yeah, you're right. I'm totally overreacting. I'm sure it was just a dream. And she laid back down to try to go back to sleep. But as she laid there, that sense of dread that something was wrong and that she had to leave right now, it was just growing and growing and growing until she just jumped out of the bed. She's just standing in the room and she says to her husband, honey, we gotta go right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we gotta go right now. And her husband did not want to go. And he said, come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal. But she was adamant. She said, get out of bed. We're leaving right now. And so begrudgingly, her husband said, okay, we'll leave right now. And so the two of them hastily packed up and then went downstairs and left a note for their relatives explaining their absence, and then they got in their car and they drove off. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey back home. It was called Bullion Bend, and it was a very windy road up in the mountains where one wrong turn and you're going flying down the side of a mountain. After driving through this area for about 15 minutes, they rounded a particularly sharp turn, and as soon as they made the turn and could look down the road, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, she saw up ahead on the right, off the side of the road several feet, something that was just lying there on the side of the road. She didn't know what it was. She thought it was maybe a bag or some trash or maybe a dead animal, and at first she was just going to dismiss it. But as her husband drove closer and closer to it, the light began to illuminate it, and she looked at it and couldn't really discern what it was until they were right next to it. And she looked out her window and she noticed it was a woman's body, a woman who had no clothes on, who was just lying there totally motionless. And Deborah immediately turns to her husband and says, honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road. And her husband immediately is kind of panicked and doesn't slow down. He just keeps driving and says, hey, should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her. But Deborah at this point is now terrified, and she's saying, no, keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there and they're going to lure us in and they're going to attack us if we try to stop and help her. And so in this kind of chaotic, frenzied reaction that Deborah and her husband are having, they decide that their best course of action is just to drive on and find the next payphone and call the police. And it just so happened that less than a quarter of a mile away was a ranger station with a phone. And so they pull into the parking lot and Deborah calls the police. The police tell her to wait inside of her car and they'll be out in a couple of minutes and they're going to need her to bring them up to where she saw this body. So a couple of minutes goes by, the police show up, and they tell them to drive back up the road, but stop about 200 yards short of where you believe this woman's body is. And so Deborah and her husband, they get back in the car, they drive back up the road where they came from, and right at this point where the road turned very sharply is where Deborah knew on the other side of this turn would be this body. And so they pulled over on the side of the road, the police came up on their side, and they said, yep, right around the corner, you're going to find her lying on the ground on the left side. And so Deborah and her husband are just sitting in the car watching as the police go up, they make that turn, and they kind of disappear out of sight, and then they see their spotlight moving around on the other side of this turn, and so they figure, okay, they're looking for the body. But after several minutes, the police came back down the road, and they stopped next to Deborah's car, and they said, you know what, guys? We didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary. And Deborah would say to police, I'm not lying. I know what I saw. It was a woman's body right there in front of me. I know it. It's right over there. And they would tell her that we believe you, but we can't do anything because there's nothing up there. And so they told Deborah and her husband to just head home, and they did. After Deborah and her husband took off and were gone, the two responding officers drove back to their police station, and once they were inside, they began speculating about what Deborah might have seen. And as they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser, and he overhears them, and he goes over, he's intrigued, and he asks them, what happened? What did you see? And they explained to him that this woman, Deborah, had spotted a supposed dead woman's body up on Bullion Bend. And as soon as he heard Bullion Bend, Rich remembered that just a couple of days ago, they had received a missing person report of a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son named Nick, who had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Bullion Bend. And so Rich wondered if maybe there was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. And so the next morning, Rich got up early and he headed out to Bullion Bend, and when he reached the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen this dead woman's body, he found a children's shoe. And so he stopped his car, he got out, he picked the shoe up, and he's looking around and he's looking for anything else that's out of the ordinary, but there's nothing on the road, there's no skid marks, there's no other debris, there's no other clothes, there's nothing. And so he walks over to the guardrail that overlooks this very steep embankment, and he looks down the other side, and at first all he sees is just trees everywhere, but as he's looking, he thinks he sees more clothing farther down the mountain. And so he climbs over the guardrail and he very carefully maneuvers his way down, and after only a couple of seconds, he reaches a clearing in the branches and the trees, and he can see down to where the train kind of levels off, and right down there is a smashed up red four-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she went missing. And so Rich ran down the mountain, following debris all the way to this wrecked car. He goes around to the driver's side and he looks inside, and there in the driver's seat is Christine Skubish, and unfortunately she was deceased. And then on the passenger seat is her son, Nicky, and he is alive, but barely. He had gone 5 days without food or water, and doctors would say when Rich found him, he probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours before he would have died as well. Authorities believe Christine fell asleep at the wheel and she drove off that embankment. Initially, Rich believed Deborah must have seen Christine when she was driving through the mountains and saw that woman on the side of the road. After her accident, Christine must have gotten out of her car and then climbed up that embankment and then laid on the road, hoping someone would see her, and then when no one stopped for her, she went back down to her car where she ultimately died. But according to the coroner, that would have been impossible, because when Christine crashed off the road, she died on impact 5 days before Deborah saw that woman on the side of the road. So it could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of the road. But it is objectively true that Rich only investigated Bullion Bend and found Nicky alive because of Deborah's police report about this dead woman on the side of the road. And Deborah was only on that road because she'd had this totally weird middle of the night urge to suddenly leave a relative's house and drive up into the mountains, something she had never felt before and didn't really know how to explain. So either this is an extremely strange set of circumstances, or Nicky had a guardian angel. A 35-year-old woman, who we'll call Olivia, met her husband for lunch at a restaurant in western New York. The couple had not originally planned to stay at this restaurant for very long, but one thing led to another. They were having a nice time, and before long, it was 6 p.m., and they had been there for 6 hours. And over those 6 hours, both of them had had a lot to eat, lots of bread and pasta and cakes and all sorts of stuff, and they had had some alcohol, but not very much. Olivia had been careful to only have 4 drinks over those 6 hours because she wanted to be able to drive. And her husband similarly limited his drinking so he'd be safe to drive. And so after they got the check and they paid for their meal, they both hopped in their respective cars and they began driving home. As Olivia was making her way home, she unfortunately got a flat tire, and so she pulled off to the side of the road and she called roadside assistance. As she was waiting for help to show up, another motorist happened to drive by and they misunderstood what was happening. They saw Olivia standing outside of her car with the tire popped off, and they thought she'd been in an accident. And so they called the police and reported it. And so the police show up a few minutes later, they pull up right behind Olivia, and when they get out, they ask her, are you okay? Do you need any help? And she would say, oh no, I just had a flat tire. I'm totally fine. Thank you for stopping though. But the police, as they're listening to her speak, they see her eyes look kind of glassy and glazed over like she's drunk. And as she was speaking, they could have sworn she was slurring her words. And so they said, hey ma'am, have you been drinking tonight? And she would tell them that, well, yeah, I have had a few drinks, drinks, but only 4 over the last 6 hours, and I don't feel drunk at all. That has nothing to do with the situation I'm in now. I'm not drunk. But the police were not buying it, and so they put her through a series of field sobriety tests that she managed to get through, but she struggled with enough that it sent up some red flags. And so they made her blow into a breathalyzer. A breathalyzer is a device that uses your breath to register how much alcohol is in your system, also known as your blood alcohol content, or BAC for short. BAC is scored as a percentage out of 100. And while no one should ever get behind the wheel of a vehicle if they are impaired, it is the case that in America, you are allowed legally to operate a vehicle if your BAC is 0.08% or lower. For reference, if a 160-pound female consumed about 3 alcoholic drinks, maybe a little bit more, in the course of an hour, she would most likely have a 0.08% BAC. If that same 160-pound female were to consume, let's say, 8 alcoholic drinks over the course of an hour, she would definitely not be allowed to legally operate a vehicle because she would be very, very drunk. Her BAC would have spiked to 0.2%, which would put her in the range where she would most likely have alcohol poisoning, and eventually she would most likely lose consciousness. If this same 160-pound female were to consume 13 alcoholic drinks over the course of an hour, her BAC would jump all the way up to 0.4%, where she's not just drunk and unable to operate a vehicle. At that level, you're talking about potentially dying from consuming that much alcohol. When Olivia blew into this breathalyzer, she fully expected that she would be below the 0.08% legal limit, because after all, she'd only had 4 alcoholic drinks over a 6-hour period, and so that would put her well below that legal limit. But that was not the case. She blew a staggering 0.33%. The cops couldn't believe what they were looking at because they're looking at Olivia and they're thinking at that level, she should be somewhere between losing consciousness and dying. But here she is just standing there talking to us, acting a little bit buzzed. And so they assumed their breathalyzer must have made a mistake. So they went back into their car, got another breathalyzer, did it again, and again, Olivia blew a 0.33% BAC. The officers couldn't understand how this woman had such an extreme alcohol tolerance, but regardless, they charged her with driving while intoxicated and then brought her to the hospital for medical intervention. There, her BAC remained high even after a full day had passed without her consuming any more alcohol. This is around the time that it was discovered that Olivia had a very, very rare medical condition called auto-brewery syndrome, which in a nutshell meant her body transformed glucose from foods, specifically carbs like bread, pasta, that kind of thing, into alcohol. Olivia, who was totally unaware of this condition, had developed this wicked alcohol tolerance because she was basically drunk all the time. Not because she was a heavy drinker, but because she ate carbs. This condition, if left untreated, can do the same damage alcoholism and binge drinking can do to the body. The only way you can treat it is by drastically changing your diet. When Olivia's condition was discovered and made public, the charges against her were dropped, and she would go on to just stop eating carbs. Just how smart crows are. In scientific studies, crows use logic to solve puzzles, and in one study, a crow was given a particularly challenging puzzle that required the understanding of analogies to solve it. And on this crow's first attempt, it immediately recognized the pattern and solved the puzzle within seconds. In the wild, crows will fashion their own tools, like a hook made from a bent twig that they'll use to help forage food more efficiently. Crows will also host these huge funerals for their fallen comrades. But the most fascinating aspect of a crow's intelligence is how they employ it against us. The same way we study crows, crows study people. They watch our behavior to look for patterns to help them determine if an individual is a friend or a foe. Once a determination is made, that crow doesn't forget. And they pass it off to their friends and their family, who will immediately put this information to use, even if they've never had a first-hand experience with the person in question. For the people who are determined to be the worst foes, like people who have tried to do harm to the crows have been known to stake out that person's house, and every time they come outside, they will swoop down violently trying to hit them, and they'll caw at them the whole time, and this behavior can go on for years. On the other end of the spectrum, the people who are determined to be the best friends friends of the crows get a very different treatment, one that seems like it's straight out of a fairy tale. In 2011, 4-year-old Gabby Mann was living in Seattle, Washington with her family. One day, when she was getting out of the family car, she dropped a chicken nugget onto the ground. And before she could pick it up, a neighborhood crow swooped down and took the free lunch. A few days later, when Gabby was on her back deck having some food, she dropped a piece of bread on the ground, and just like the last time, a crow came flying in and took it before Gabby could do anything. And because Gabby was a messy eater, she continued to drop food everywhere she went, and so she continued to inadvertently feed these crows. Eventually, every time Gabby went outside, a murder of crows would assemble in front of her house, so a big gaggle of crows, and they would just follow her around everywhere she went. As Gabby got older, she grew to really enjoy the attention from all these birds, and so she started feeding them huge portions of her lunch before she hopped on the bus to go to school. When she got back in the afternoon and hopped off the bus, there would be this murder of crows sitting on the power line waiting for Gabby. When Gabby's mother discovered where most of her daughter's food was going, she wasn't upset. She was just worried her daughter wasn't getting enough to eat. And so she told her daughter to stop giving away her lunch, and instead they would go out and buy some food just for the crows. And so, starting in 2013, when Gabby was 7, she and her mom began feeding the crows every day. Each morning, they would go out into their backyard and they would refill the bird bath with fresh water, and then they would put peanuts into the covered feeder and scatter dog food in the backyard. And the crows loved it. A few weeks into this new feeding ritual, Gabby went outside one morning to refill the peanut tray when she noticed something was already on the peanut tray. There was a small earring. She brought it inside and she showed it to her mom, and her mom said she hadn't put it there, and so Gabby was convinced the crows had left her a gift. Her mom wasn't sure. But over the following few weeks, when more and more little trinkets like a marble and a polished stone and a screw and a metal hinge, when those started showing up in the peanut tray and in the bird bath, Gabby's mom actually went out and installed a camera to look out into the backyard to see if it was really true that the crows were the ones leaving these things behind. And after reviewing the footage, she was amazed to see that, yes, the crows would come in and they would eat their food, they would drink their water and clean themselves, and then they would leave behind these shiny little trinkets as if it was their way of saying thank you for the food. Gabby was over the moon for these little gifts. She began collecting all of them and putting them in a jewelry box and labeling them of when she got them and how important they were to her, ranking them from most favorite to least favorite, her favorite being this little piece of metal that said best on it, and she jokes that the crows have the other half that says friends. But the crows' most astonishing gift came the following year in 2014. Gabby's mother was an avid photographer, and one day she was out by herself photographing a bald eagle that had come into town. And while she was taking these shots, she managed to drop a lens cover to one of her cameras, and she heard it hit the ground, but she was so busy taking photos that she told herself she would pick it up before she left. But after getting totally wrapped up in this photo shoot, she forgot about the lens cap on the ground and wound up going home without it. That night, when she got back to her house, she happened to go out onto her back deck as the sun was setting, and she thought she noticed something in their bird bath. And upon closer inspection, she couldn't believe what was sitting there. She ran back inside and opened up her laptop and pulled up the footage from the bird camera she had set up, and there it was, a crow coming into the yard before she had even returned from this bald eagle photography session. This crow was in the backyard with the lens cap in its mouth, and it went into the bird bath and it very carefully washed the cap in the water, and then it placed it very delicately on the side of the bird bath and checked it a couple times to make sure it was steady, and then it flew off. This behavior is very significant because it means the relationship between the crows and Gabby and her mom was not a transactional one. They were not just simply leaving behind these trinkets as a way of paying for the food. They were doing it because they had grown attached to Gabby and her mom. So when Gabby's mom was out in town taking photos of this bald eagle, at least one crow had just gone with her. And when this crow saw her drop the lens cap, it snapped into action, swooped down, picked it up, and returned it to the house because that's what best friends do. Today, Gabby and her mother still feed the crows every single day, and the crows still love Gabby and her mother. It was 2 days before Christmas in 2010, and 54-year-old Alan Catterall, along with his future son-in-law Mark, were sitting in the break room of a kayak molding facility in the United Kingdom where they both worked. And as they sat there drinking tea, they began exchanging notes about what gifts they got for the rest of their family for the holidays. And as they spoke, they both were very careful to keep their voices very quiet in fear that someone might overhear them, because Alan's wife and daughter also worked at this kayak company. Alan had worked for this company for 10 years, and even though it was backbreaking work a lot of the time, he loved it because it meant he got to spend all this time with his family basically 24/7. It was only 7 a.m., which meant Mark and Alan had just started their shifts, but they were already taking this break to talk about Christmas because they were so excited about it. But they finally said, okay, we do need to go to work, and so they put their cups in the sink, and then Alan made his way down to the factory floor, and his future son-in-law Mark made his way up to the control room. On the factory floor, where Alan was heading, was where all the special machinery was inside of these little rooms where the kayaks were actually molded and put together. And it was Alan's job to make sure the machinery was clean and operational. The machinery inside of these little kayak making rooms was very customized and very finicky, and so Alan was one of the few people at the company who really understood what made it work and what would cause issues, and so he was very valuable at the company. That day, Alan knew one of the circuit boards for one of these molding rooms had shorted out, and so the leadership had decided to shut down that particular molding room while the circuit board was fixed. And so when Alan went down and began checking out each of these molding rooms, he knew which one had been shut down. So he knew when he went in there, it was not going to be operational. But when he went into that particular molding room, he noticed that it really needed a good clean. When these kayaks were made inside of these molding rooms, a lot of times the excess plastic would kind of seep out of the actual mold, and it would get caked to the walls, and it would flake all over the ground. And so periodically, Alan would clean these rooms, and he figured right now, with this one shut down, he might as well clean it. And so Alan grabbed a crowbar, and he headed into this shut down molding room, and he got to work chipping all this plastic off the walls and making a big pile on the ground to sweep out and throw away. But as Alan chipped away at all the plastic, the doors leading into this molding room shut. And so suddenly Alan was cast into total darkness because his only light before that had been coming through these doors. But that was the least of Alan's worries. He knew that if these doors were shutting, these doors were automatic, that meant that the circuit board had to have been fixed, and they didn't know he was in here. And so now this molding room must be operational, which meant he only had minutes to get out of this room. And so Alan ran to the door, and with his crowbar, he began trying to pry the doors open, but he couldn't. These are mechanically sealed doors. They do not just open. You need to press a button to release them. But Alan's in a total panic. He knows what happens in this room, and he just can't get the doors open. And so he began banging on the door with his crowbar and screaming for anybody out in the factory floor to please stop this process that's surely starting inside of this room. Open these doors, get me out of here. But it was so loud out on the factory floor, nobody heard him. And so before long, Alan must have looked around and saw the walls inside of this tight, cramped space beginning to glow red. Because this molding room was actually just an oven. It reached almost 600 degrees Fahrenheit in about 10 minutes. And so Alan is watching as this oven is restarting, and he's sealed inside of it. And so the walls turned bright red, and then before long, the crowbar he was using to try to open the door must have become so hot he couldn't have held it, and then the ground as well would have been red hot, and his shoes would have begun to melt, and then the air temperature inside would have gotten so unbelievably hot he couldn't have breathed. And so screaming in pain and pounding on the door, leaving his skin on the door every time he hit it, Alan eventually just collapsed to the ground in unimaginable pain as he cooked alive. Finally, when Alan caught on fire and black smoke began coming off of his body and pouring out onto the factory floor, the factory realized there's a problem with this molding room, so they turned it off, they opened it up, and they discovered Alan. It would turn out, after Mark and Alan had chatted about Christmas in the break room and then parted and gone their own ways, Alan had gone down to the factory floor and inside of that molding room, and his future son-in-law, Mark, had gone up to the control room where he would have no visibility of the factory floor. All he had was this big switchboard full of lights and switches and gauges that controlled all of the molding rooms. And not long after he got up there and was looking at the control panel, he saw a blinking light come on. And it was for the molding room that Alan was working inside of. And that blinking light meant someone had fixed the circuit board, and so that molding room room now had power. And so reflexively, Mark just turned it on. And when he did that, the molding room began its restart process, which included sealing its doors and turning on the oven. And inside of that molding room, there were no safety escapes. In fact, there was really no safety precautions at all with regards to these ovens. And so as soon as Mark flipped that switch, he had killed his future father-in-law. 5 years later, the Kayak Molding Company was convicted of corporate manslaughter and fined £200,000. Also, the man who actually designed these molding rooms with no safety precautions in mind, no emergency exits, nothing, he was fined £25,000 and sentenced to jail for 9 months. On the morning of June 25th, 2007, a 28-year-old man named Mike Barnett woke up to the sound of pounding rain on the roof of his home, which was located in Hull, which is a city in northern England. Mike groaned as he rolled out of bed. It had been raining like this for the past month, and he and the rest of the people in Hull were just totally over it. But another reason he groaned is he knew that he would have to go to his job at a tropical fish store, even though he was not scheduled to work that day. There was a street right behind the tropical fish store that always completely flooded out from all these debris getting clogged in the drain, and the owner of the tropical fish store, so Mike's boss, who was an elderly guy, he would always go out and try to clear the debris himself, and Mike just knew, he really needed help, and today he knew his boss would be out there, and so he just felt like it was his responsibility to go in and help him clear out the debris. So Mike got dressed, he had some breakfast, and then as quietly as he could, he slipped out the front door. Mike was careful not to make too much noise because he didn't want to wake his dad, who he lived with. Mike and his dad had always been very close, but after the death of Mike's mother, he and his father had become even closer, and so they actually really enjoyed living together. But Mike also knew that his dad was very protective of him and very likely would not like the idea of Mike going out in this horrible storm to go try to clear debris in a flooded out street. It just was too dangerous. And Mike just didn't want to deal with that right now, and so he was able to slip out without waking up his dad. Mike hopped in his car and he drove to the fish store, and as soon as he got there, he hopped out, he went around to the back side of the shop, and sure enough, the entire street out back was totally flooded. Clearly, debris had blocked the drainage system. Now, Mike's boss was not out there yet. Mike could see him inside the shop, kind of going about his morning, and so Mike, without even going inside, just began wading into the water to begin clearing debris. The drain that was clogged by all this debris was located just off to the side of the sidewalk. It was down in a culvert. And so Mike very carefully walked off that sidewalk into this very cold, muddy water, and he began moving in the direction of where he knew the drain was. And so as he's walking, the water is down to his ankles, maybe up to his knees at some point, but he gets closer and closer to where he knows this drainage is down in this culvert. And suddenly, Mike begins feeling this unbelievable suction at his feet that began pulling him basically straight down. Mike tried to move, but his feet were anchored to the ground, and then before long, he began getting pulled forward towards this drain, and then down he went. And as he went all the way down to his neck in the water, he felt this unbelievable pain in his thigh. Mike didn't know it, but his leg had been sucked through the drainage gate that was all blocked up. There were still some holes in it, and so his leg had gone through one of those holes, and it had pulled him all the way up to the top of his thigh and brutally snapped his leg in the process. And so Mike is in blinding pain from his leg being shattered and run through this grate, and he's literally up to his neck in this frigid water, and the wind's blowing and it's raining and the water's going in his mouth. And so Mike begins to panic and he's trying to pull himself out. He can't, and then he begins screaming for help. And at that moment, the owner of the fish store, who was still inside the store, looked out the window and he saw Mike flailing around. And instinctively, the owner could tell just from the panicked look on Mike's face that whatever was happening to him was an emergency. And so the owner just picked up the phone, called the police, and after telling them what was happening, the owner ran out to Mike. When the first police officers arrived on the scene, Mike was still in the water up to his neck, and the shop owner was right next to him. And the police officers, they assessed the situation in front of them, and they thought, okay, clearly this guy, Mike, is trapped in the water. This is serious, but we can pull him out. That's the obvious solution here. And so the two officers walked up to Mike, they waded through the water and got on either side of him, kind of pushing the shop owner out of the way. And then the two officers grabbed Mike's shoulders. These are strong police officers, and they began pulling on Mike. And as soon as they did, Mike let out this unbelievably loud scream of just pure agony. And in fact, his scream was so guttural that the two officers let go and were kind of startled by it. And very quickly, these officers realized this situation is far worse than it appears. Because not only is this guy totally stuck and he can't be moved, but, they're looking around and the rain is still coming down and it's clear the water is still slowly rising. And because Mike's body was situated over the grate, he himself was causing even more blockage, increasing how much the street was flooding. Meaning the officers knew they had to get Mike out as soon as possible or he would drown. But over the next several hours, more police officers, firefighters, EMTs, Good Samaritans, everybody showed up on the scene, and there were so many attempts to get Mike out of the water, ranging from trying to cut the grate, but the water was too muddy so nobody could see through it, and the water was so strong that nobody could set the bolt cutters on the actual grate. And then at one point they even tied a winch around Mike and tried to pull him out with a Land Rover, but every intervention failed. The rushing water that was pinning Mike to this grate was so strong, and Mike's pain in his leg was so high, it made it nearly impossible to move him. And so finally, at the 4-hour mark that Mike has been trapped in this water, a decision was made amongst all the first responders to amputate. So the police called a doctor who was willing to perform the leg amputation. And then after doing it, Mike could sense something was up. Clearly it's not going well. And he began frantically asking the police and all the first responders, when are you going to get me out of here? When are you going to get me out of here? And they just kept telling him, soon, Mike, hold on. It's going to be okay. Meanwhile, the owner of the shop at this point had called Mike's dad to tell him what was going on. And so as all these people are waiting for this doctor to show up to cut Mike's leg off, Mike's father shows up and basically barrels through the crowd and starts screaming, "I'll get my son out of here." But as soon as he saw his son, he was totally taken aback. Mike was up to his chin in water. There was a diver behind him in the water with him, holding him up, barely keeping his head above the water. Mike's face was totally pale and his eyes were totally unfocused, and he had this weird blank expression like he wasn't even there. And then a second later, a whole wall of police came running up to Mike's dad to stop him from getting any closer, and they told Mike's father they were doing everything they could to try to get his son out, and for now, they told him he just needed to go home. And so even though Mike's dad did not want to abandon his son, he could tell with all these police standing there in front of him, there was no way he was going to be able to go up there with his son. And so he would turn around and head back home without even speaking to his son. And then when Mike's dad got home, he turned on the news, and the news was showing live coverage of his son trapped in that grate. And just a couple of minutes later, Mike's dad would watch his son die on the news. By the time that doctor arrived with that special saw to cut off Mike's leg, it was already too late. Mike had passed away from hypothermia. On February 17th, 2004, shoppers inside of a massive Japanese superstore called Jusco in Wakachi City were suddenly aware of a loud commotion. When they went to investigate, they found a thin young woman with a young baby strapped to her chest, grappling with an older man. Initially, onlookers didn't know what to do. They stood there shocked at what they were seeing. Then the woman yelled out, "Thief!" The man she was fighting with was in his late 60s, and he had pinned the woman and her baby up against this bank of ATMs, and his fists were clenched like he was holding whatever it was he took from her. 3 men from the crowd immediately jumped into action and wrestled the man off of the woman and pinned him to the ground and began trying to pull his hands open to take out whatever he had stolen from this woman, but the man would not unclench his fists. And so these 3 men yelled out to the police that happened to be nearby. They ran over and jumped on top of this guy and handcuffed him, and the man, as he's laying on on the ground is yelling out that he did nothing wrong, and then onlookers would say he began moaning very strangely before he began violently vomiting before falling unconscious. While the police waited for emergency services to show up and take this man to the hospital, they were able to open up his fist and discovered the only thing he was clutching was his own bank card that was now bent in 3 places. The wallet he had on him belonged to him, and the bags that were lying on the ground all around him only contained some pet supplies that he had recently purchased. It did not appear he had actually taken anything from this woman. And speaking of this woman, the police were so caught up in the chaos of the moment that they hadn't even thought to look around for the victim to see if she was okay. So they poked their heads up and start looking around the crowd for this woman, but she's nowhere to be seen. And so they asked the crowd, do we know who she is or where she went? And nobody knew. The police did think it was odd that this woman had walked off without talking to them first, but they figured if she walked away, then everything must be fine. And so they labeled the incident an attempted robbery and they closed the case. The following day, the older man, who became known as Mr. A by police, died at the hospital as a result of heart failure caused by extreme stress. When the police found out about this, they simply went into the case file, updated it to show the suspect had died, and did not investigate further. But Mr. A's family refused to believe he had just attacked a young woman and her baby. It was completely out of character. He was a gentle retiree who had spent 40 years working for a chemical manufacturer and now was collecting a pension and working part-time as a security guard. He lived with his wife, his children, and his grandchildren, and he lived about 1 kilometer away from the Jusco, where he had gone that day to get some hamster food for his grandson's hamster. His family pleaded with police to reopen the case and investigate this woman because she must have done something to start this altercation. The police initially resisted, but ultimately conceded and said, okay, we'll check the CCTV camera footage at the Jusco to make sure we didn't miss anything. And what they discovered terrified them. A camera overlooking the ATM bank where this whole scuffle went down picked up this woman about 5 minutes before Mr. A walked into frame. She was standing in a corner just off to the side of the ATMs, and she did appear to have a 2-year-old or 1-year-old strapped to her chest, and she was just standing there motionless with her back to the corner looking down. And then when Mr. A came into frame, he appeared to pull some money out of the ATM. He had bags all over his arms. He turned around after getting his cash and started walking away. And as soon as he does, the woman in the corner suddenly becomes animated. She lifts her head up and walks straight past him, skimming his chest with her hand as she passed. And right after she did that, it was like Mr. A had a reaction to being touched by her, and he instinctively grabbed her arm, and that's when the struggle ensued, and that's when the woman yelled out thief, although it's clear from the footage that she is the aggressor, not Mr. A. And then at some point, the 3 men jump out of the crowd, they pull him to the ground, the police show up, and then at some point during this chaotic melee, the woman just stands up and meanders her way into the crowd and disappears. Although the police searched every piece of footage in and around this ATM all around the time of the incident, they never found any footage of this woman entering or exiting the Jusco. It was like she just appeared in that corner in order to go after Mr. A and then vanished as soon as it was done. And none of the dozens of witnesses that watched the scuffle take place right in front of them in broad daylight were able to provide any sort of meaningful description of this woman. It was like nobody got a really good look at her. But after reviewing hours and hours of the CCTV footage, the police did find one instance where this woman, for 1 second, looked up at a camera exposing her face. And her face was so unsettling to police that they actually decided not to share the image with the public for an entire year. They were scared that if people saw this image, it would scare them from ever going back to Jusco. This is the image of the woman. As you can see, her face is totally emotionless, her eyes are blank and downcast. Some have compared her face to a death mask, which is a plaster cast of a dead person's face. Other people have said she doesn't even look human. After seeing the CCTV footage, Mr. A's relatives sued the police for detaining him and pinning him to the ground despite his obvious medical distress as a result of whatever this woman did to him. Eventually, they did reach a settlement, but what they really wanted was an explanation for who this woman was. But even after the police released this strange photo to the public, nobody ever came forward, so she was never identified. And it's unlikely she'll ever be identified because the statute of limitations for this case expired in 2011. The case, which is now referred to as the Jusco Phantom, is still very famous in Japan, and it remains a popular topic on long internet chat room threads where people exchange this eerie photograph and speculate about who or what killed Mr. A. In the late afternoon of May 1st, 2016, 13-year-old Shoaib Ahmed and his 9-year-old brother, Abdul Rashid, chased a soccer ball across a dusty plain near their little rural town in Pakistan. Abdul, who was very athletic and quick on his feet, managed to kick the ball past the defender and then kicked a line drive shot right at the net, but at the last second the goalie jumped and blocked the shot. And so Abdul threw his hands up in exasperation, but even though he was frustrated he missed a shot, he was having a blast. He loved playing soccer with his brother and the neighborhood kids. But as much fun as he was having, Abdul at some point looked up and he noticed the sun was starting to set behind the mountains. And immediately when he saw that, the expression on his face went completely deadpan. And then he looked over at his brother, Shoaib, who also had noticed the sun was setting. And by this point, Shoaib was already rushing over to Abdul. He grabbed Abdul's hand, and the two brothers, without a word to their friends who were just kind of standing there watching, they took off and just hustled back towards their home. The brothers made it to their home, but on the porch, Shoaib, the older brother, just collapsed onto the ground with his arms and legs going totally stiff and his jaw locking up to the point where he couldn't even speak. And Abdul, instead of trying to help his brother, just stepped clear over him and ran into the house and made it to his bed just in time for him to also collapse, but onto the bed, with his arms and legs being just as stiff as his brother's and his jaw also being locked so he couldn't even speak. And then moments later, the boy's father would scoop Shoaib off the porch, carry him into the bedroom, and put him in a bed, cover him up. And then the father would rotate Abdul, who was on his stomach, over onto his back, and he put the covers over him. And then the father just left and got into his own bed and went to sleep. And this was a typical night in this family's household. The next day, a convoy of fancy cars descended on this little village where Shoaib and Abdul lived. And in these vehicles were all these scientists from Pakistan's Institute of Medical Sciences, and they had heard about the boys' nightly bizarre collapses, and they wanted to find out if the condition was real. Now, if the scientists had arrived in the village before sunrise, they would have found Abdul and Shoaib still in their beds in a semi-comatose state, unable to move, but it was almost noon by the time the scientists arrived, and so when they saw the two boys, they were outside, goofing around and playing, acting like everything was totally fine. In the village, neighbors referred to Abdul and Shoaib as the solar boys because they were only normal and active and like the other kids during the daylight hours when the sun was up, and then at night they would become totally paralyzed and mute. Now, the villagers saw this happening, but they didn't really believe it necessarily. They thought maybe the kids were making it up to get attention, or maybe they were doing it as like a grift to get people to donate money to the family. But Shoaib and Abdul's father completely denied this and said they had not made any money from what was happening to his sons, and all they wanted to do was just figure out what was wrong with them so they could help them. The scientists would talk to Abdul and Shoaib's father first, and he would explain to them that really since Abdul and Shoaib were very little, they had been suffering from these nightly paralysis events. And so with the family's permission, these scientists got to work. They collected blood and urine samples, not just from Shoaib and Abdul, but from the entire family. And then also, the scientists tested Abdul and Shoaib's balance and coordination, obviously during the daytime, and the boys both did completely fine. And then as sunset approached, the scientists just stood there and watched as Abdul and Shoaib slowly lost control of their bodies and became paralyzed and mute. And then throughout the night, the scientists just continued to watch them, and the boys did not move at all. And then when the scientists attempted to kind of move their limbs for them, they were so rigid, almost like rigor mortis after you die, that they really couldn't move their limbs at all. And then, the next morning, as the scientists were watching, the sun came up, and it was like suddenly Abdul and Shoaib were totally back to normal. They popped out of bed with a smile on their face, able to move around, no problem. And so to the scientists who watched this go on, they were left thinking, okay, there's no way these kids could be faking this. Like, no one could fake this. This is real. But the scientists really didn't have any new information to pass to the family because, the boys' blood and urine samples came back completely normal, and they had passed all of their balance and coordination tests. And so it seemed like, Abdul and Shoaib should be totally normal, healthy boys, but they just weren't, and these scientists didn't know why. Now, Now, these scientists were not the first group of people who had tried to solve the mystery of the solar kids. For years, their father had been trying to find someone who could help them, but he was having no success. Doctors in the nearest hospital to their village were convinced that the boys had a rare illness that made them extremely tired only a couple of hours after waking up in the morning. But Abdul and Shoaib had loads of energy all day long. It was only when the sun came down that they became totally paralyzed. And so the father didn't believe those doctors were really taking this that seriously. The imam at a local mosque was convinced the boys were possessed by demons, and so he organized an exorcism where a group of religious leaders basically tapped on the boys with sticks while chanting in rhythm and dousing them with holy water, but that didn't work. And so the family was close to giving up on ever finding help for their sons. But then, in April of 2016, so a month before that team of scientists descended on the village to research the boys, a TV news reporter from Pakistan's version of CNN came to the village to interview the family because this reporter had heard about this strange condition these boys had. And this interview was seen by millions and millions of people, including Pakistan's most esteemed and influential doctor, a man named Dr. Javed Akram, who happened to be the vice chancellor of Pakistan's Institute of Medical Sciences. Dr. Akram had never heard of such a strange condition, and so he was the one who ordered those team of scientists to go to the village and research this family. And after those scientists came back and checked in with Dr. Akram, it was clear they had not had a sort of breakthrough moment with regards to what was going on with these boys, but they were very convinced that this was a real condition. And so Dr. Akram decided that he and his team would just continue to study this family until they figured out what the heck was going on with these two boys. And finally, a year later, in May of 2017, Dr. Akram believed he had figured out what was wrong with them, and he even had a solution. But his solution was so simple that Dr. Akram actually kind of second-guessed himself, thinking, this is too good to be true. So the doctor decided he would run one more experiment just to test his theory and make sure he really was correct. And so Dr. Akram flew Abdul, Shoaib, and their father out to his institute in Islamabad, and that night, Dr. Akram watched as the two boys slowly slipped into paralysis as the sun went down. But this time, as soon as the paralysis was clearly beginning, Dr. Akram gave each of the boys a pill. And 40 minutes would go by, and suddenly Abdul, who was totally mute and laying there still, broke into a smile, and then he raised his right leg. And then Shoaib, right next to him, he too smiled and turned his head. And then 20 minutes after that, both boys were up on their feet, totally fine, laughing and joking, because they had never really done anything at night. They were always paralyzed as soon as it started to get dark. It would turn out Dr. Akram and his team had discovered a very strange mutation in Abdul and Shoaib. Our brains naturally produce all sorts of chemicals that keep them running, and one of those chemicals is called dopamine. Dopamine does several things, but one of those things is it controls muscle movement. The mutation that Dr. Akram and his team had discovered was that the boys' genes were mistakenly shutting off dopamine production every single night, and so that was why they were becoming totally paralyzed. This mutation was the result of a series of complex genetic mistakes, but the fix was actually quite simple. The pill that Dr. Akram gave Abdul and Shoaib was just a dopamine pill, and what it did is it basically just turned the boys' bodies back on. And so Dr. Akram and his team had discovered quite possibly the world's rarest disease, only afflicting one family. But fortunately, they had also found the cure too, and so Abdul and Shoaib, from that day forward, lived totally normal lives by taking their dopamine pills every night.